to do another video on hip thrusters. Yes, hip thrusters yet again. But I've got multiple requests on this, and a lot of people, basically the response is they want me to go more in depth on the science of it. They want a more serious video detailing that. So, to provide science in seriousness, I put on a shirt. So, just to clarify that. So, hip thrusters. As I stated in the last video, they are a good movement. So they're great. I use them as part of an assessment strategy, as part of the DNS school of thought. It's also used with FMS, functional movement systems, and probably other ones as well. Basically more of like a glute bridge, but essentially the same exact thing. And also use it as a cueing movement. So teaching movement patterns, cueing movement, getting glute engagement and firing before moving on to larger movements. My issue comes in with people that do heavy weighted hip thrusters. So basically from non-weighted to moderately weighted, I don't see any negative effect. And you know, the issue I have is with strength athletes is people using excessive amount of weights and doing hip thrusters, trying to set PRs, doing a lot of weight, and hoping that it has a carryover to their strength sports. And I'm going to demonstrate today why it doesn't. Now, that said, hip thrusters do, basically in all forms, engage the glutes very well. I think Brett Contreras has done some EMG studies on the glutes in the hip thruster movement and shows a high level of activity. So even with weighted, that doesn't change. I'm going to talk about how it changes when you get too much weight added. With that said, I'm speaking to strength athletes. I just want to clarify that because some people had some confusion saying, you know, I'm talking to everyone. I'm talking to people that apply power to sport, and that's what we want to address. So, you know, I'm sure that it builds a nice, you know, shapely derriere if it's activating the glutes, causing some hypertrophy, and those sorts of things. And again, for strength athletes, you're going to find it effective in cueing. Now, before we jump into the conversation, I'm going to show you something. This is actually really useful. So go ahead and come over here, Jody. So I'm going to teach what's called it's a breathing exercise called the Levitt. It's from Dr. Carl Levitt from the Prague School of Medicine. And what we're going to do here, Jody, is I want you to breathe out. So basically forcibly exhale every last little bit drop of air. Anybody, like in the bodybuilder perspective, has done an underwater dip tank. You want every last drop of air out of your system so that you can measure the best. So you're going to just forcibly exhale everything. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Push it all out, push it all out, push it all out. And this is going to cause nice tight, what we're doing is teach him in this rib cage position. And he's real tight here. Look at that. I can just punch him. He's rigid and solid. So this is teaching very good core position. We're getting the obliques involved. With what we had with the rib cage position, what I'm teaching him here, and what we're cueing and showing is how to get the pelvic floor to work in opposition of the diaphragm, which creates the correct intra-abdominal pressure that we're going to then be able to fire from the hip extension, which is what we're firing the glutes for, to be able to either propel our body or transfer power to shoulders, arms, or wherever it is that our sport has us delivering power. So here's the key thing. What we're doing with firing the glutes and what we want to accomplish with sports is transfer power, but we don't do that independently. So you have to follow me here. They have to be working in a system. So that system of glute firing through hip extension must have a rigid core to fire through. So as we're doing that, go ahead and do this again. Okay. Basically, this is going to force him to get that pulled down. We're going to have, it's going to stop him from being able to have excessive lordosis in the back, so he's going to have a nice neutral spine here. But what we've got, and this is what happens when we get into heavily loaded, and I'll demonstrate exactly why and how that happens when we get into a heavily loaded hip extension, is you'll have some deviations. Go ahead and flare at the rib cage here. So here, this is what we call, and yeah, we've got some anterior pelvic tilt here. If you go ahead and arch a little bit in there as well with the low back. So there we go. So we got some anterior pelvic tilt. We got flaring of the thoracic spine here. What this is called an open scissor right here. And this prevents us to have proper intra-abdominal pressurization. Just simple fact. So the pelvic floor cannot work in opposition to the diaphragm. We're not going to be able to stabilize properly here or transfer power efficiently. Okay? Yeah, there's entire schools of thought on this. I'm not going to go into a whole level of detail, but this is very important. So for the glutes to be able to transfer power, they have to work properly with the system that we had before. So go ahead and fix all that stuff. See how that fixes all that right there. So I don't want you to forcibly exhale before you lift heavy. I'm just doing this to be able to cue and teach them the proper positions here. But this is what we can't lose. And this is what's going to happen when you put too much weight on a hip thruster. Now, why is that? Well, I could get out the drawing board. Well, actually, I can't. I'm way too out of practice. This is actually, a problem that I would probably have one of my engineering managers work with his engineering team, and they do all the math on it, and I'm too rusty on all that stuff. So tell you what, I'm going to actually just show you what happens instead of sitting there doing a bunch of math on the board that's going to hopefully argue my case. We'll just physically show you. Okay. Go ahead. All right, what have I got here? So instead of the drawing board, I've got physically represented my femur, my core, my hip, and over here, we've got a fancy fish scale. So he's going to pull 60 pounds of tension on here, and we're going to call it 600 for math, for our purposes here. And what we're going to do is we're going to load this hip. And imagine me laying down, okay? So if I can deadlift 600 pounds, how much weight, we're going to find out before I have some deviation here in that 600 pounds due to these levers, am I going to get some braking here where I can't actually get full hip extension? So because there's a lot of people that say, oh, I've got full hip extension. Look at the videos. If you know what you're looking for, you're going to see the deviation from that position that we just talked about. So let's see where this happens. 18 pounds, so 180 pound. 180 pound hip thruster. Holy crap, you're losing it already. 180 pounds with these levers. Yep, 60 pounds, so my 600 pound deadlift. I can't get full hip extension with these levers. You're deviating somewhere. Let's see what happens if we actually put more tension on here. 440 pounds. Is that the right one? Oh, 350 pounds. Come on now. Let's pull that 660. Okay, look at that. The system has changed. Your glutes are firing. You're getting glute engagement, but you are not training the system that you want. So if you want to continue to teach a pattern, which is going to translate to a squat or deadlift, what I call a remedial pattern, go ahead. You're training the wrong pattern. Hip thrusters are effective. They're a very good tool. Use them appropriately. Don't overload the motion. Unless you're working on developing physique. Again, I coach athletes.
All right, so just a quick summary. Using hip thrusters or glute bridges as an assessment tool, very effective. Using it to cue proper movement patterns, very effective. Using it in a lightly or moderately loaded fashion for both strength development, physique enhancement, going to be beneficial. Where the question comes in is when we use it in a heavily loaded fashion. In the example that I showed, it was roughly around 30% of my squat or deadlift max, where from a leverage perspective, I was not able to achieve full hip extension. So those are going to vary slightly based on someone's unique build and leverages, but you're not going to see that much variation. So that's where you want to check the ego a little bit, make sure that you're keeping the weight less than that, or change the movement and do something differently that's going to have some carryover. So again, speaking directly to sport or strength development aspects, where we're trying to train that system, and not isolate out and break that chain. Why is that? Why isn't the isolation good there? Again, we're talking about hip extension, very important mode of transfer of power. So hip extension is very dependent on integration to deep spinal stabilization, and we lose that once we're not able to maintain that hip in relation to the spine and all of the intricacies that are going on there when we have that open scissor, which is going to be from either that extension at the T-spine that we saw, slight lordosis beyond neutral in the low back, anterior pelvic tilt. Any of those things are going to start breaking that, where we're not able to have that opposition of the diaphragm to the pelvic floor, and basically ability to achieve deep spinal stabilization and proper intra-abdominal pressurization. So, with that in mind, from a strength and sport perspective, we're definitely not doing anything. We're using energy doing that movement to those excessive loading patterns that isn't getting us any benefit, and potentially is training the wrong patterns. So we want to avoid that. So those are that's the summary. Good, very beneficial. Questioning its approach, and possibly negative once we start using excessive weights on those movements.